You've got to get up pretty early in the morning to speak to America's hardworking farmers and food producers. We should know. FLM Harvest is a strategic, full-service creative consultancy proud to reach more farmers, farmer boards, and food and commodity associations than any agency in the country. And we understand omni-channel as well as we understand the journey from field to fork. Most importantly, we connect clients to the audiences that matter to them.
Thank you for joining us for our Agri-Pulse Washington Week in Review. I'm Spencer Chase, joined as always by Agri-Pulse Executive Editor Phil Brasher, discussing the week that was, agriculturally speaking, in Washington, D.C. And you might notice, if you're a very astute observer, we're on the House side of Capitol Hill today, and it's us and like three other people right now. The House on recess this week. Not exactly an abundance of activity on this side of the chamber. The Senate is in town, but still a few things to summarize for you here this week. First one being some progress, publicly stated progress at least, on the U.S. and China negotiations. A Chinese Commerce Ministry spokesman saying earlier today, I suppose you could properly couch it, given the time difference between the U.S. and China. We're coming to you here on a Thursday afternoon. But a Chinese Commerce Ministry spokesman saying that tariff reduction and tariff elimination is part of the Phase 1 deal, the Phase 1 conversations between the U.S. and China. Keep in mind, we do know that there is some semblance of an agreement on that Phase 1 deal, but we haven't seen the specific text quite yet. And Phil, just on the broader scope of what this could potentially mean, this has got to be some semblance of a signal of progress.
Yeah, and I think some of the other things that have been happening sort of the sidelines haven't been getting the attention. One thing, the USDA, the Food Safety and Inspection Service, put out a rule, final rule allowing imports of Chinese-produced chicken. Now, this has been an issue that's been around for years. And the fact that this comes out now, it's probably not coincidental. I'm sure it's science-based. That's what the administration would argue. But you start seeing these things, and that's start to pop. And he said, yeah, we are getting close to something happening. I think one thing is pointing out what agriculture is really looking for is the start of some major purchases and actually happening on the ground. That's what we're, of course, waiting to see, hard commitments from the Chinese. What we're also hearing, though, that some of the issues, agricultural issues, we thought they might all be wrapped up in an announced deal. We're hearing that no, some of these things may not get ironed out until later.
Right, and we do know that this agreement that they're discussing now, they're calling Phase 1, that they do not have a predetermined set of phases at this point. We could see a couple more in these negotiations, but definitely something to watch. And we do know that the Chilean government, as you've probably heard by now, announced a cancellation of the summit where the U.S. and China were planning on signing this deal here in a couple weeks. The U.S. now working on a new location to sign that agreement. It's still up in the air, still no final determination on where exactly that will happen. But again, both sides still publicly at least saying that they're working toward progress, working toward a signature on that agreement. Because keep in mind, this is a big factor in this trade negotiation, trade policy from the Trump administration is China, but there's also the renegotiation of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, by which producers have been pretty heavily impacted. And we do know that House Democrats, a group of House Democrats were in Canada this week. We've paid a lot of attention. There's been a lot of reporting on the relationship between the United States and Mexico on this deal, but Canadian negotiations still up in the air. Excuse me, up in the air is probably a bit of a strong way to phrase it, but we do know that House Democrats were in Canada this week. And Phil, I forget how many times we've heard House Speaker Nancy Pelosi say that they're on a continued path to yes, but we sit here another week gone by. We don't have the formal implementing language, but we also don't have negative comments from House leadership saying that this deal is just not going to happen.
We'll get a better idea next week when the House comes back. Everybody's back in town. They have 2 weeks now until Thanksgiving recess. And of course, playing into all of this is the impeachment process. Democrats and Speaker Pelosi are really under a lot of pressure to show that they can get this done, to get the USMCA approved, that the impeachment process is not inhibiting their ability to get things done that are important to the country and toward rural voters in particular, because we know they have a number of first-term members who will be up for re-election next year. And on the other hand, Republicans are putting a lot of pressure on Democrats, saying, you're not getting this done, it's getting delayed, and it's because you're too focused on impeachment, you're obsessed with this issue. So,
Well, and just one point to mention on impeachment, and we mentioned this not because we plan on covering this too deeply, but just to make a note of the legislative oxygen this is going to occupy. The public hearings on the impeachment process set to start next week. So if we thought the impeachment process had been taking up a lot of space and taking up a lot of energy up until now, next week things escalate to a bit of another level as these committee hearings, which had been kind of behind the scenes at this point, some testimony had been released by House committee leaders. Now these are going to be live public hearings that the American public can consume for its own, and so that's another thing to watch in terms of just the broader tenure and the broader climate here on Capitol Hill. And
right, it's a good point. And then you're going to the House floor. So you're dragging into potentially December, and then to the Senate floor. So who knows what happens to the schedule over there, assuming the president is impeached in the House. You have a trial in the Senate. I mean, we're just really tying up Congress on both sides of Capitol Hill for weeks to come.
Right, weeks to come before the end of the year, and here we sit 2 weeks before, two really legislative weeks before Thanksgiving for the House and Senate. As a quick reminder, government funding set to expire November 21st. We have not seen any kind of an ironclad CR that would move that date back, nor have we seen an omnibus that would move things into the remainder of the fiscal year. As Phil shakes his head, not optimistic that will happen by November 21st. But Phil, just as we mentioned, the House not in town this week, but their staffs are. Any progress that you can report to our anxious viewing public here?
Very little. As you mentioned, the current continuing resolution that's funding the government runs out on November 21st. The current discussion is to pass another one to go into December, somewhere in there, while they continue to try to negotiate. Now, I have to tell you, the negotiations over the appropriations have gone almost nowhere in the last couple of weeks. The biggest issue continues to be the president's insistence on funding for the wall. Democrats have not allowed a major funding bill to go forward in the Senate. Covers the Defense Department as well as Departments of Labor and Health and Human Services. So that funding bill is stuck. They still even have agreement on the spending levels for each of the departments and agencies. And so, I mean, there's only so far you could do. So they are a long way from having a final spending bill for fiscal 2020, which, I'll remind you, started October the 1st. So we're a long way from there.
Well, and just very, very briefly here, we also saw this week a number of House Democrats reaching out to their own chamber leadership saying, hey, can we maybe do something about the tax extenders, including the biodiesel tax credit that so many people are paying such close attention to in rural America, and not seeing a ton of movement on that front either.
No, that's a lot of frustration there on the part of the Senate and House Democrats not moving on that. That's tied to this appropriations issue too, because the appropriations bill and whatever moves in December, if it moves in December, is presumably the vehicle for an extension of those expired tax credits, tax incentives. And if there's not a resolution on one, it's difficult to get the other, and we don't even have an agreement on those tax extenders yet. So not looking good right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is one of those week in review videos where we at the end will encourage you to stay tuned, because it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks in DC, really an interesting couple months as we stare down the barrel of the end of 2019 and look around the corner and see an election year. So a lot of folks are really hoping to get their policy priorities across the finish line before the end of this year. Next week going to be a very interesting one for Team Agri-Pulse. We will literally have people all over the country. I would encourage you to keep an eye on things that are going going on our own website about some of the various issues and policies that we cover. Sure to be an interesting week for us and in turn for you. But I think that's going to do it for this week. So for Phil Brasher, I'm Spencer Chase. Have a good one.